Okay, Mark, thank you very much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks, Jamie. Great to meet you.
So, we're going to get into your view of the mining industry today, your kind of long and illustrious career. But I was thinking about how I wanted to start this interview. And I recently read something that I thought might be an interesting place to pick off. So, do you know what the most common career goal or like aspirational career is of a high school student today is?
It's probably not mining, would be my best guess. And so I'd love to hear what it is today.
Okay, so in like the 1950s to 60s, it was an
Yeah.
astronaut, which fair enough, who doesn't want to be an astronaut? But today it is social media influencer is the number one career goal of like a 17, 18-year-old. And when I was reading your bio, as I understand it, at 17 or 18 years old, you left high school and went and worked at a coal mine.
Yes, I did.
And
Um,
it's hard to imagine the average 18-year-old today getting excited about that option, but it sounds like you were. And I'd love to understand what was going through your head at that time and how that all came about. I know you're from a coal mining town originally, but what kind of led to that?
well, you're going to laugh. Well, congratulations, by the way, in choosing a career that everybody wants to be in, by the sound of it, in terms of social media. So well done.
Well,
Well done to you.
I'm also a mining engineer, so I have a bit of both in me, I suppose.
Okay. Well, I was asked that question recently for another thing I was doing, and people were quite shocked by the answer. And I said the three things that motivated me to join the mining industry were: one, girlfriend; two, being able to stay in Wollongong and continue to surf; and three, being able to earn money to pay my way through university, because my father, being an immigrant from Italy, had a very traditional view about the sort of career choices I should make, being either a doctor or a lawyer. I certainly wasn't going to be a doctor. I'd applied and got into university to be a lawyer, but that would have meant I would have had to have gone to Sydney. And the family couldn't help pay my way. I'd have to pay my own way. And I had a friend who was working in one of the local coal mines and said, well, gee, we've got a cadet position going. He said, the trouble is there's about 150 applicants. And I said, well, just throw my name down, because if I could get that, I could go to Wollongong University, do mining. I'd be there for at least 6 years. I'd be earning a wage and I could support myself. So the reality, I was lucky enough to get it, obviously, but the motivation to join the industry was certainly not as altruistic as I would like to tell the story. That's the truth.
Okay, so we've got women, surfing, and money. Basically, those are
Well, I'd
the
like to say a woman.
a
It,
woman.
it was
Sorry,
it was
yes.
more about the girlfriend, but again, at 18, I mean, what do you know about career choices and the options?
Hmm.
And what struck me, and this is the probably more interesting part, I thought, well, I could start in December, and I had 3 months before I had to pick up the law degree and start up in Sydney. So I figured that if I really didn't like the choice I'd made, I could change my mind. And 47 years later, I still think I made the right choice.
Yeah, you're not going back to law school anytime soon.
No, no time soon.
So what does an 18-year-old do at a coal mine when as a cadet? I mean, cadet, I wouldn't think is a role that exists at many coal mines today. What does that look like?
Well, firstly, what they do is in the cadet role, you get experience in every department in the mine. And the plan is you do it over 4 years. Then you go and do university full time, and you're doing your part time university. And then you go and do 2 years full time to finish your degree on. In my case, I got to do the early start. And about 3 years in, I said to them, I'd like to go and work as a miner, but also I don't want to leave and do 2 years full time. I'd prefer to keep working and still do the 2-year full-time university, but work on night shift.
Hmm.
So I was able to finish the degree in the same amount of time, but I kept working all the way through. One, because I'd become a bit of an entrepreneur and was investing in a few things as a young guy, a new condo and things like that. And so I grew used to having money to spend. So the good side of the employment is I saw every department. I worked in finance. I worked in all of the departments. And I was the guy that if they couldn't find anybody that would have to do a difficult job, I was the one who'd put my hand up and said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll have a crack at it. And so the great thing about that is I got a wonderfully diverse exposure to all facets of mining, which really triggered the thinking you could literally pick any career and there would be something available for you in mining. And that's the great thing about the industry. It's so diverse and so many opportunities.
You know, you mentioned that you kind of had that 3 months before school started to figure out if this was a world you wanted to live in. What was there a moment in that 3 months where you were like, okay, this is for me. I love mining, or did it happen more gradually after that? Or was there this kind of watershed moment where you're like, this is quite special?
No, it was probably for the first time that I really had a chance to think about career options because I took the time to ask people about what were the career options. It was really interesting. One of my relatives said, oh, well, your aspiration must be to be a mine manager. And I said, well, no, not really. I said, the mine manager at our mine is 30 years old. And I said, there's a bigger career beyond that. And he said, well, what's beyond the mine manager? And we talked about the regional manager. We talked about ultimately the global head of Rio Tinto or
Hmm.
COA at that time out of Melbourne. And it was something that you didn't appreciate until you're in the business and you asked lots of questions. And then when you looked at all the career options, I said, you know what, this is going to be quite interesting. And what struck me in the conversation was a technical background with, if you add finance to it. And I ended up I did 3 years of an MBA and then got offered the biggest gold general manager role in the industry in Kalgoorlie, and I didn't finish the last year, but I got the background I wanted. So there were so many options. So in that 3 months, I did my homework. And that's when I thought, you know, this is a good choice. I had an option of going to BHP in personnel as well.
Like
Uh,
HR, effectively?
yeah, in
Yeah.
HR. And I actually looked at HR and I looked at the technical side and I said, you know what? A technical grounding in an industrial profession probably gives you a lot more openings further down the track. And the way I describe, when somebody says to me, you're one of the few mining guys that's actually the CEO, I said, yeah, the one advantage I have is I know what I'm looking at in terms of a mine. And it is an advantage. But I mean, the skill sets required are much broader today. But in those times, the ability to understand what you're looking at, resource potential, is something that I think has differentiated me through 47 years in the industry.
You know, it's really interesting to me personally that you say that because, like I said, I'm a mining engineer as well, and I always knew I wanted to go into business. My father's an electrical engineer, and when I was looking at university programs, I very clearly remember a conversation I had with him where we talked about like you can always learn business, but if you have that technical grounding of an industry, it just gives you so much more opportunity within that space. And somewhat similar to you, I mean, I didn't have a particular fascination with holes in the ground when I was 18, but I wanted a job where I could travel. I wanted to be able to work outside and not be in office. I wanted to, you know, make some money. And mining kind of stuck a lot of those boxes for someone that grew up in a pretty small town and hadn't been many places. So it's
What I
interesting
hadn't,
to see the parallels there.
yeah, what I hadn't appreciated in mining, and I only reflected on this after I finished my program, it's a very broad course. So you do electrical, you do mechanical, you do
Yeah.
civil, you do all the engineering disciplines because they're all part of what you do. Whereas in many of the engineering disciplines, they're much more specific. And I always say the smart guys, men and women, are the electrical engineers or the chemical engineers, and we as the mining guys, we sort of tend to be at the tail end, but it's a much broader
Yeah.
discipline that also goes more into management. And again, I found that to be quite useful in later years in terms of the broader management
Yeah.
context. But I've always been inquisitive. That I think makes a difference. If you're inquisitive, you tend to sort of hunt things down, try and understand what makes them work.
I'm laughing because I remember a professor I had in university who was a mining engineer, and he worked in South Africa for years, sort of big open pit mines. And he said, the mining engineers are the only ones that understand everything. He's like, the rest of them are just rivet counters, is what he said.
Well, I
Which I
always
don't
thought
think is
that.
fair, which I don't necessarily think is fair, but
I think that's
yeah.
right. Although there's one thing that I do remember. We had a Chinese head of mechanical engineering and mechanics in particular. And being one of the mining engineers in a much broader class, we weren't good for homework, and we tended to have many other activities that we put a higher priority on. And he said, okay, the exam this time around will be open book. And everybody's going to say, oh, that makes it easy. Anyway, I remember, but the open book was you allowed 1 page of notes. So I put my key formulas on that 1 page, but the exam was not like anything we'd ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
And what you had to do was interpret what the question was and apply your formulas appropriately. And there were only 3 of us that passed the exam. And I got 90%. And because I had the formulas,
Yeah.
I understood the logic and was able to, it was a quick sort of application for me. And I remember him saying to me, you're brighter than you look. and I still,
High praise.
but it was interesting if you're in understand. So it's a matter of understanding what's wrote and understanding the actual course and the logic of stuff is really important. And that's what I've always done, is dug into the theory to try and understand the topic. And that generally stood me in reasonably good stead.
And it sounds like, even very early on in the industry, you understood the potential for what a career in mining could lead someone. And you had pretty big aspirations, it sounds like, to take a leadership role at a major company.
So I was always motivated. I remember the career coaching conversation I had at CRA is they said, where do you want to be? And I said, I'm not sure yet. But the one thing I do know is I don't want to be in a role and think this is it.
Yeah.
And I said, I can see I'd like to be an under manager, or I'd like to be a mine manager. Look at Ray and Bruce, they're 30 years of age and they're in those roles, and they can look forward and think about what they may be doing next. I said, I don't know if I could be the CEO of CRA or Rio or something like that, but I just don't want to get to a place and think, for the rest of my life, this is where I'm going to be. And
Yeah.
I'm 66 and I'm still in the same place. I don't want to think this is it and I keep working and I won't retire.
Was there anyone early on that sort of took an interest in you or sort of acted as a mentor that helped you kind of move up through the ranks and sort of understand the potential and kind of unlock the skill set that you've developed over the last 40 years?
I've been lucky. I've had lots of wonderful people that have helped me on the way through. I remember a guy called Rod Ruston, who was the general manager at Westcliff at the time, had some real challenges, and he taught me about planning, and he got it down to understand where you want the business to be, and your job as the chief mine design engineer is to invent ways to get there. And I thought that was a wonderful way of sort of saying, be creative. Let's define what best is, and you show us how to get there. And for a rural kid learning about mine planning and those sorts of things, and you've been basically told, go and work out how we get there.
Hmm.
That was a great opportunity, and the feedback you got from the rest of the team was fantastic. One other guy that I remember very well when I was about 32, 33, running the super pit in Kalgoorlie, which was myself and Tony O'Neill were. I was the general manager and he was the mine manager. We developed a whole new concept in Kalgoorlie, which really changed gold mining in Australia in many ways, in the West Australia. And I remember the chief operating officer for Home State in the US was sort of a self-appointed mentor, and he'd bring me a book every 3 months when he visited the site, and I had to read the book. And the books were The Worldly Philosophers, The Covenant, which is the story of South Africa. And the irony there is I ended up working in South Africa for 6 years. And all these books about personal development and non-mining stuff.
Yeah.
And he said, my job is to create a full person that could lead the company one day. And he took a personal interest, and he was tough, he was demanding, but also supportive, and was someone that I could run ideas past without worrying that he might be critical because it was a dumb idea. And I've had a few guys like that in my career, so I've been very lucky.
What was the first leadership role you really took in the industry? When did you go from sort of engineer, or cadet initially, into taking a role where you were leading other people, making decisions, having a lot of responsibility?
So there were supervisory roles, and I was a mine manager, a mine superintendent at one stage. But the first management role was to manage Coalcliff. So the mine where I started, I was in the management, the manager's role. I was probably about 27 at the time, and the intention was to close the operation. And there were two
Well,
operations, Coalcliff and Darks Forest. So they were connected. And my boss said to me, don't touch anything. We want to close the place in 12 months. And they've been trying to close the place for a number of years. But in Australia at the time, it was very difficult to close stuff. The union was very strong. And politically, the company was a bit nervous about shutting it. And Lee Clifford actually was the head of the coal division. And we developed a plan. Rod Ruston was involved, the guy I mentioned earlier. And we developed a plan where we could actually halve our costs. And in the conversations with the team, I was thinking about how do you articulate the severity of where we are as a business? If we don't do something different, we're gone.
hmm
Two, that in many ways, these were all the senior guys in the business, and roles were bid by seniority, the amount of time you're in the business. So the part of the business I was running were all the senior union guys. So they're all 55 years and older. And they, quite frankly, weren't too worried if it had to be a closure because they'd walk out with redundancy agreement. So I then said to them that I'd been told I wasn't allowed to touch anything. And I said that we're known as F Troop. Now, F Troop, for those that can remember way back then, was a TV show about the worst army team in the US cavalry, Ken Berry, Forrest Tucker. And for those my age, they'll remember the show. So it was the worst of the army. They were crooks and all sorts. And I said that was our reputation. And that was extremely insulting to everybody. But I said, we've got an opportunity to show that we're a troop. And in the next 2.5 years, safety, no accidents. We doubled productivity and we halved our costs. Very similar to the Anglo story in many ways. But
Yeah.
it was about a group of people who were galvanized behind the concept. Nothing to do with money. It was all about showing that they were people that could deliver something special. And so it was us together as a small team creating something very different. So I sort of created us against the world, but they were the ones who designed the change. And so for me, it was a great learning experience because I try to work out how to motivate people. And a group that were about to retire, they didn't have anything else to motivate aside from that personal motivation and self-pride, or pride in themselves and pride in what they could do together. And they were wonderful. And in the end, it wasn't my success, it was their success. They did a wonderful job, but it was a great learning experience.
I'm really personally interested in how you achieve that, right? Because you're 27 years old. These guys are twice your age. They're approaching retirement. They've got a good soft landing on the other end of that. It sounds like they're being mildly disparaged by the company. So what do you like? How do you actually implement that change of culture and attitude? Are you standing up and giving speeches? Are you sitting down one-on-one with these people? Are you working with key leaders and helping to propagate it through through the F troop or whatever? How does the
All of the
actually
above,
implemented those changes?
all the above. And um, what Rod Ruston did in his role in the business, he defined what we had to achieve. Just, you need to achieve this cost number. And given that labour is 50% of your cost, you can only do it with half the people. And by the way, you have to double your production at the same time. And so, it was half the people, and we had to improve our production by about 25%. So you had half the people, you had to improve 25%. So I started with that. And I said, the alternative is there is no operation. And most guys said, well, who cares? And I said, well, don't forget, there are young men coming through that if we don't survive, they don't have something to come to. So,
Yeah.
first point, it's not simply about us, it's about who follows and creating employment for potentially their own kids. So, how do you bring the imperative back to them? It was a conversation. So, one, it was honest. It was an honest conversation about how we were perceived. And by the way, you said they were mildly disparaged. No, they were openly disparaged, and they knew it. I was the first guy to actually say after it. Now, after it was a bit of a makeup, but
Yeah.
they knew they were being disparaged.
And was that warranted at the time? Or had they underperformed to a degree that warranted the disparagement, or was there more to it than that?
Um, Partly, but also a function of they didn't think they were being respected as they should have been. So I think it was both ways. But at the end, it's the leader that has to be the one that is accountable for making a change. So my first conversation was, I know we haven't done all the things we should have done as a company. I know we haven't provided consistency of approach or strategic direction, but here's where we are, and here are the challenges we confront. And from my perspective, I can listen better, be more responsive to what's important to you, but at the same time, I can't deliver everything. And so it was a really open conversation about who we were. Now, the advantage I had is I grew up as a young guy with some of those people. So they knew me. And I'd been through as a miner, and I'd worked underground. They knew I had my degree, and this was my first management job. And I told them,
Hmm.
I said, I'm basically told not to touch anything because things keep going the way they are. They'll be able to demonstrate to the government that we should be closed. I said, none of us should want that as an outcome. Even if it's not for us, it's who follows. And it was that conversation, not as a sort of on the pedestal. It was a conversation in the bathroom, what we used to call the change rooms, where we had them all around, and we had this conversation about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Felt both ways. What did we need to change? And I said, look, there are three things we have to do. The question is how. I've got a view, but if it's just my view, it's not going to work. We need to have a view. And over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we workshopped with everybody different ways and means of designing an intervention that would work. And it was significant, and they were great.
And what was the final outcome here? Presumably that mine did not get shut down and improved
No, it
performance.
went
And
for
yeah.
another 10 years.
went for another 10 years. We got another 10. Now, it was getting towards the end of the life of the resource, but there was still at least another 10 years
Yeah.
that we could get. And they gave it their best. And we exceeded all the outcomes that we targeted, and they got another 10 years life, the operation. Now, most of those guys retired. But again, I think more than anything, each guy retired proud of what had been achieved because they weren't disparaged. People knew what they'd done.
Is there anything about that outcome that surprised you at the time? Were you shocked at how well it went? Was that what you expected? Did it change your view on managing people, managing these businesses?
It was, once you're in the conversation, the changes occurred quicker than I'd anticipated. And part of that, I think, is they had something to prove. And again, it was a bit of a risk telling everybody that everybody sees this as true,
Yeah.
because you've got nowhere to go if that goes badly. But I said to them, I said, look, we've got nothing to lose. I said, I know most of you personally. I know who you are, and I know that you know how to run this place better than I do. And I'm asking for you to help, and let's see if we can create a bit of a future here for who may follow. And to a person, they stood up. There were a few. There's always a cynic, and
Yeah.
it'll be the same. No, we'll do all this, and they'll still fire us in 12 months' time. And there are a few tests too, because we changed some of the industrial practices, using contractors, doing things that they would never agree on. And once we got to that performance level, and it was about the end of the 2 years, they started to test our resolve on sticking to some of the work practice changes, because they said, we know you're making money now. And so we had a couple of skirmishes in testing our resolve, but we stood our ground, and we worked it out together. So it was a great experience, and ultimately ended up being the reason I ended up going to Kalgoorlie, because I had someone come in to audit the work we'd done on maintenance and other things. And at the end of it, he said, look, I'm going over to run the gold mines for Alan Bond and the new stuff that they've just bought, and we need some different thinking. And he said, we'd like you to consider the role as the general manager of the KMA gold mine. So it was the start of the super pit. But it was the Colcliffe experience that he said, what you've done with the team is very different, and they're a tough old team. And he said, I've never seen a group of guys so committed to achieving something. So it's funny how the things you do turn out.
And you alluded to this at the beginning of this topic, that this is not dissimilar from what you experienced at Anglo some years later, Anglo American.
Yeah, because when I started at Anglo, look, firstly, Anglo's been a wonderful company for a long period of time.
I think it's
Very successful.
107 years old. Do I have that right? Something
Yeah,
about that? Yeah.
yeah. Centenary was 2017, and the world had become much more aggressive, much modernized. So you had the rise of CRA around the iron ore assets in Australia, which is Rio, and Rio came back in and took up a big position because CRA had started to outstrip its major competitors, and it did a lot of things very different on the organisation side, which I think made a real difference. BHP was stepping out, becoming more global. Xstrata, Mick had done a wonderful job bringing Xstrata out of the Billiton, the mix, and then BHP Billiton came together, and Anglo got left behind. And with that, there was restructuring. Cynthia was appointed, I think, around 2006, 2007. She started to introduce some changes. They didn't go all that well, although she made some serious changes, particularly in safety and other areas that I thought were company changing. But in 2013, we were missing our targets. We'd fallen well behind our major competitors, and I think our market cap was about 26 billion, and we're a company that, in my view, should have been double that at least. And so when I started Anglo, what I did find is we depleted our technical teams across the board. So as the group tried to manage its cost structures down, it looked at cost and not value. So it was cutting the key areas that ultimately contribute long-term value and drive
Right.
productivities. And so we had to reset. We had to do something very different with the assets, people. So as a starting point, it needed a major makeover. And in the period 13-14, we did a lot of restructuring of the business to set it up.
So I have some statistics here that I have taken from the internet. So we'll see if they're correct. Tell me, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. So tell me if I've got these right. But from your time starting at Anglo, it says safety improved considerably, 93% reduction in fatalities. Occupational health improved considerably, 90% drop in new cases. Environmental incidents down 97%. Production increased by 12%. Productivity more than doubled. Unit costs improved by 45%. EBITDA increased by 40%. Do those all kind of ring true to you?
Yeah, the doubling of productivity and the real cost reductions were in the range 40 to 45. I guess the most important statistic for me, from April 13 to my last day, we had delivered an average 22% return to shareholders. So if you invested $1 on the first day and looked at it on the last day, it was worth $5. That was over 9 years. So that first 2 or 3 years were tough, where we went from 68 assets down to 37 assets, but the 37 assets we kept all improved by more than 40% in that same period. So instead of losing 45% of your production because you've reduced your asset base, we actually increased production over that period. That's how we doubled productivity, because we went from 160,000 people to 95,000 people producing the same amount.
So I'm just thinking about how to address this. So you come into this role. This is one of the oldest mining companies in the world, an absolute behemoth. I've worked for major contractors. I've never worked for major mining companies, but I presume the bureaucracy at that point must have been very complex. Where do you get parachuted in as CEO? Where do you even begin to start thinking about turning the ship and solving these problems? How do you even identify and prioritize the problems? Like, what is your first, you think of a president, right? The first 100 days of his in office, what does he do? What's your first 100 days as CEO of Anglo American look like?
We did the first 100 days. We literally did.
Oh, did you? Okay. Yeah.
We came, so nothing new. And we did a 100-day review. And in mining, if I just say, most companies, and I mean most companies, don't understand the resources they have in the ground and the potential to deliver better productivity or lower operating costs. They don't pay attention to the nature of the resource, how big it could be. And we're going through the same process at Vale. So that's first point. Do we understand what we're standing on? Second thing is, are our mining methods, and there's almost an infinite amount of mining strategies you can apply depending on what you're trying to achieve. And three, are we efficient in doing what we've decided to do? And so I focus on those three areas, and you put a team together. We call it a salt and pepper team. A few external players that have been around for many years, with internal people who understand why we've done certain stuff. We did an asset review. And the asset review took about 6 months. But we had enough in that first 100 days, and I talked to every person, the top 150 people, one-on-one, 2-hour conversations right across the organisation. So there was enough information to say, we've got to do something very different with our resources. Our mining strategies in key areas need to be rebuilt, and our efficiencies are probably half what they need to be. And then the asset review, which finished about 3 or 4 months later, confirmed exactly where those points were. And it also identified that about 45% of the assets were never going to really add material value. So the question was, do you sell, or maybe even shut, those assets and redirect the capital that's invested in them into other parts of the portfolio where you can get a 3 or 4 times return? And so it became around, it became focus on the assets that could really make a difference, change the mining, the understanding of the resource and the mining strategy, and then it introduced industrial logic like a Ford or a petroleum plant in terms of efficiencies. And so it was a 3-part restructuring of the business over the next couple of years. And that drove productivity, operating cost reductions. It also, because you're focusing on planning the way you're doing things, you're also getting at safety, environment. You're also, I think we're also the first group to really identify the importance of sustainability and social partnerships with communities. That was the other big issue, because we were in emerging markets, more so than a Rio or a BHP. We had to work with our communities in a very different way than what they had available to them with the big assets. And so it was a very different type of approach.
When you're, it's interesting you say that sort of industrial logic approach. When I listen to you say this, it makes me think of, I read Jack Welch's book, I think it was Winning, when I was in high school, and he talks about, anything that General Electric, GE couldn't be a number 1 or number 2 in the world in, they shut down or sold off in their portfolio, and they really prioritized a more core set of assets and corporations. And it sounds like you sort of took a similar approach, that these mines that you didn't, or am I misunderstanding that?
So, yes and no. First point, understand the assets you have and the potential they have. And most companies don't understand the best the asset can be. So I go back to my coal cliff experience.
Yeah.
We reversed engineered the business. So my challenge to the asset team is reverse engineer every one of these businesses to be in the bottom half of the cost curve. And those that can't be, we've then got to question whether they've got a role in the portfolio. Because if you're not in the bottom half of the cost curve, because of the volatility of commodity prices, there are going to be times when you don't make cash, you'll make short-term decisions to protect cash, and you'll destroy the underlying ability of the asset to deliver as good as it could be. So we gave them some rules of thumb in terms of the way to look at the assets. And that's how we then said 45% of the assets, and that only represented about 20% of the production. So it sounds worse than it is.
So 45% of the assets only represented 20% of the production. Interesting.
Correct.
And
so
presumably that's the most expensive production as well, too.
Yes. And somebody said, Cutifani is shrinking the business. No, Cutifani wasn't shrinking the business. Cutifani was going to increase the production, but do it far more efficiently. So the important thing was we actually increased our production by 12%, 14% by 2019, actually. But we did it at a 30% in nominal terms lower price. So we doubled our margins. So we doubled the money we made. So our share price, and when I started, the share price was trading 13 to 17. We ended up getting up to 40, over 40, plus dividends and everything else. But the key was take a bit of Jack Welch, take a bit of when Alcoa was doing In Control and Capable and running its processes very efficiently. So I took a bit of the Alcoa stuff, took a bit of the best of what I could see in the industry, but then went out and said, and we have a guy that helps us, Tony O'Neill does the mining work that we worked on. He was brilliant on the mining side. The guy called Mick McAleer came out of the steel industry and was very systems orientated, control systems, planning, asset integrity work. He was the best I'd seen there. And a guy called Tony Filmer, who used to run the technical group at CRA before they decided they didn't need technology, we snapped him up. And he helped with Tony O'Neill and Mick transform the way we thought about our business. Because the other thing was we didn't have the big Pilbara assets, iron ore, we didn't have Carajás, we didn't have Bowen Basin in coal, we didn't have these big copper assets. We had deep, difficult mines in platinum, we had small iron ore in Kumba, we had some copper assets. So we had to turn those assets into world-class operations, which required a whole different approach to the way we were running the business.
And something I'd like to note here, what are the years you did this, Mark? When did you start? Was it 2013? Do I have that
In
right?
13.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
in
9 years.
13.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you had a pretty shitty market behind you most of that time too.
Well,
Like
15 was the
you
worst.
weren't
Yeah,
you weren't
15.
hiding behind a massive bull market that you could hide all the inefficiencies in.
Well, I got we're all human. I recently somebody said, "Oh, Mark had what did they call me, a fair weather CEO?" And I said, "Well, wait a minute. In 2015, prices were their lowest. If you looked at the basket price, the lowest they've been in 50 years." And I said, I had to cut 70,000 jobs. Show me where that qualifies as being fair weather. We had to do the most significant restructure in the industry in 50 years to get to the outcome. Somebody said to me that when we were doing that, people were actually very respectful because we took the time to explain the problems to people and we engaged them. And so even though we had to do some really tough stuff and we made mistakes, people understood the problem because we'd explained it and we involved them as we did the restructuring. So 15 was our lowest ebb, if you like. And you're
Yeah.
not quite sure if the industry, if it's going to work, because China, you didn't know if China was going into a recession. So at the end of 15, we weren't quite sure whether it was the right call. And I had to make an even deeper cut and said, look, I may have to cut even more assets to get the debt down. But in 15, we took 15% out of our costs in 12 months. So in 16, we started to come back up. De Beers had a good first quarter in 16. People saw that our net debt was actually over $1 billion better than we thought it would be because we cut so much in the cost. And we started to get momentum in 16. So 14, 15 were pretty tough.
Because you went from 160,000 people to 90,000, I think. Do those numbers ring true?
Yep.
And so
Yep.
how do you communicate that across an organization, right? When you're cutting huge swaths of people, how do you, in a sort of global organization, really reliant on people to be successful, how do you maintain that spirit to core and momentum while still having to jet set a lot of jobs, unfortunately?
First thing is the team was key. We confronted together the need to make change, and the team was fully engaged on the need to make change. And then as the prices dropped, people knew we had a problem. So iron ore went from $120 a tonne to $40 a tonne. So nobody needed to tell the Kumba team that we were in deep trouble. And our Kumba costs was $77 a tonne. And we said, guys, we've got to get them under 40. And so our restructuring, we changed the mining strategy. Tony O'Neill worked with Norman Bazima, and Tony recommended a whole change in the way we operated the mine. So remember that comment I made about resource and the mining strategy? Tony said, we've got to turn this mine around 90 degrees. Now, when you say change the whole mining strategy, it takes 2 years to implement that change. And we went from $77 a tonne break even to $35 a tonne in the space of 2 years. So we had to explain it. Norman had to announce significant cuts in people against that context. But when you explain it and they see the prices, they get it. And it's a difficult conversation, but it's an honest and open conversation where people understand the industry. And so it's really about being open. Now, I made one terrible mistake, which you think in hindsight. When we defined the 37 assets that would remain, I used in an off-the-cuff remark, I used core, the word core, which meant those assets that weren't in the 37 were non-core. Well, can you imagine thinking that you are now non-core? You're working in a business that's non-core. So you sort of want to pull the words back and stuff them back in your mouth.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. And so I said, look, I've made a mistake. That's not the right way to talk about it. But I am talking about where we will focus our capital, and people need to wear it. And I said, the most important thing is, in a business where you're going, and in many cases, we divested. So we didn't close them. And as I said, in divestments, if we decided not to put more capital in, you're better off selling the asset to someone who's going to give it a crack. And so those types of conversations, I think, help make it more constructive. But every word in those situations, you've got to be very careful to make sure it's the right messaging. And as I said, you learn a few things, and that was the one really important mistake that I've taken with me. And as a few of the Australian wags did, I'm non-core. So it ended up being one of those conversations that we had a bit of fun with. But it was really important. You've got to get the people thing right. And I've always talked about people of the business. But as I said, we either create a business where 90,000 people got jobs or there's none. And I said, the none's not going to happen. We're going to do what we have to do to make sure this business survives.
You've said something a few minutes ago that stuck in my mind, which is that most CEOs or management teams do not understand the assets they have. I, in my more limited experience than you, I would say that actually that really rings true to me. What makes you say that, and why do you think that is? Why do leaders in these companies not understand the projects they have?
Firstly, I make that comment of us as professionals as a broad statement in the professional side. Plus, you've got a lot of people who are running businesses that don't have that experience. But if your professional team doesn't understand the full scope of the resource and the optionality you have inside the resource, then in all likelihood, you're not going to have the right mining methods. In our industry, understanding the resource, and you would know the process we go through to model these things, but in the mining strategies, you've got an infinite number of ways to extract the resource. And people tend to go with what they know. Whereas I think maybe 5% of the engineers in the world, mining guys, look for new ways to do things. And I tell the story in the super pit back in Kalgoorlie in 1988. I met a guy who was talking about a mining strategy for the super pit that no one had ever seen before, and therefore they all said he was a lunatic. And the geo said he's going to dilute the ore body, and this is Tony O'Neill. And the mining guy said, well, that won't work. And I came in out of coal, and Tony took me through the mining strategy he had in his mind. He came out of the big iron ore mines in the Pilbara. So the big iron ore mines use this big gear to mine these big ore bodies. We have small, narrow vein gold ore bodies, but we have lots of them. And they'd been mined by underground methods. So we were mining around big holes in the ground. So it's dangerous or high risk. 2, technically difficult, and it had all these levels of complexity. And Tony's strategy to deal with all that was quite unique. And we had one conversation. I said, he's got it. He's actually got the right idea. So we then spent the next 6 weeks building a model, a financial model and an operating model to help people understand the concept. It took us probably another 6 months to get the group aligned on it. And then when we executed, it's been a great success and it's still operating today. And it's one of the great successes, I think, in mining history in the last 50 or 60 years. And it was two 30-year-olds that said, we're going to do something really different. Tony was the guy that got it, or was the one who proposed it, and I helped him market that whole approach to the whole organisation, and we put it into financial terms. So I was able to get the accountants on board, but that is rare in the industry, and we've done that a number of times. And the Anglo conversation, let's drop 45% of the assets and increase our production. In the first conversation, people thought we were nuts. And we said, well, wait a minute, let's look at Kumba. Let's look at Mahalaquena, which is the big platinum mine, which was a platinum mine that people hadn't really conceived how good it could be. And we went through asset by asset, changing people's understanding. So it's experience, and it's that inquisitive, what could be different type approach. So generally we sort of follow what's been done. We don't question how do we do it, in a very different way, and that's what I think we've brought to the industry.
It's a really interesting conversation because I'm just thinking about it now. How many major or mid-tier miners are propped up by one or two really high quality assets, and then they drag along a bunch of a bunch of mediocre assets that make little or no money, right? And so much of the value of the business is contained in a relatively small number of the assets owned by some of these companies. I mean, I'm sure we can all think of examples, but it does seem there's a somewhat of an unwillingness to cut the dead weight or to have that thinking.
So look, the major players have got good people, because one of the good things about being a major is you've got a balance sheet, you've got cash flow, and therefore good people are attracted to those types of businesses because you can see a career. And I won't name anyone, but they're in iron ore, or they're in coal, or they're in copper, and the ability to attract the best people is one of the ways you keep ahead of the industry. But what it does also run the risk of is you sub-optimize. The ore body allows you to not be as efficient as you probably should be. And I've sort of moved between the smaller group and the top end, because I find that in that mid cluster, there's so much more opportunity and so many assets that have been sub-optimized, and so much more potential, that's been a really interesting space to work. Yes, I've worked with Anglo and ran one of the majors, because at that time Anglo was the most complex. Anglo and Glencore are the two most complex major businesses because of the nature of the assets and the fact they've gone down trading, commercial approaches. And Anglo did a lot of work under Peter Whitcutt in creating a very different commercial model, which was very successful. So the big assets, in my view, risk that less than inventive, innovative approach. But in the end, it catches up with you. But in Anglo, and one thing I had to say about Anglo, the reason we went the innovation approach is we didn't have the same assets. So we had to, in a very simple way, the nature of our assets meant that our structural cost base used to increase about 7 or 8% a year, because we were going deeper quicker with the nature of the ore bodies. But if you've got iron ore or coal, you're not going as deep as quick. So your structural cost base doesn't move as quick. So we needed to move twice as fast as Rio, BHP and Vale just to keep up. And in actual fact, we outpaced them for about 7 years in our cost reduction strategy. So we moved quicker. We moved from the 49th percentile cost position to the 29th percentile. So we outpaced the three big operations on cost reduction because of the innovation that we introduced and the way we reconfigured assets. So it was reconfiguration plus new innovation. That was the key to Anglo's outperformance, in my view, over the last 7 years.
Would you have any advice for the CEO of a smaller single asset or mid-tier company that doesn't have the balance sheet of an Anglo or a BHP to necessarily hire the large teams of the most experienced people, but does want to understand their assets better and optimize them. How would you approach that if you were in that position today?
Yeah, I think single asset companies, and by the way, that's a fascinating place to be, and it's interesting, and there's some wonderful work being done by single asset leaders. The key is geology and understanding the potential of the resource. And the earlier you can work out the potential, then the smarter you can be with your capital in getting early cash flow and understanding that you won't, I'm trying to think of the right word, you won't destroy value longer term. So the key in a small company is get cash flow running as quick as you can, and then use your cash flow to then increase the size and scope of the business on the basis that you can actually self-fund that growth. So you need to understand the ore body and its potential. I once did an exercise where I can talk about it now because it's sort of all past history. When Inco, when we did we were joining Phelps Dodge, and we're looking at creating this big copper company in the nickel wars many years back. And I was leading the valuation of Phelps Dodge. And I remember presenting to the board, here's the valuation of Phelps Dodge, and here's the Tenke asset in the DRC. And I said, I'm valuing it somewhere between 0 and $5 billion. And they sort of looked at me and said, what? I said, I'm valuing it somewhere between 5 and 5 billion. And they said, well, that's not all that helpful. I said, well, let me explain. If we were to develop it and it was sitting in the backyard in Canada, it's a $5 billion net present value business. But it's in the DRC. So my recommendation is we go in with a much smaller footprint. We use a smaller amount of capital, mine the high grade, develop a cash flow, and then incrementally what we call bootstrap it up to its potential. So I said, if you said, what's the value? I'd call it $1 billion with the potential to get a 5 billion payoff if you're comfortable in managing the politics. And so that bootstrapping strategy is the right type of strategy for small companies to think about when they're developing a single asset. You can't do a Rio or a BHP or an Anglo. You've got to think very differently. So you've got to be flexible, and that's the key. And you see a lot of that. I always love to see Jim Rutherford, who used to be on the Anglo board. He's the chair of Centamin. He sort of understands that dichotomy, and whilst he's a financially trained guy, he's been around long enough to see how those approaches can be applied. He's doing a great job at Centamin, I think. So it's great to watch that sort of thing play out. But understand your ore body and what your options are.
How different is it working for a diversified miner or leading a diversified miner like an Anglo that's, got projects all over the world, but it's also got them across a variety of commodities, than a company that's, a single commodity company, whether it's, a Freeport with a focus on copper or an Inco, which would focus at nickel at the time? How does that change your perspective of a leader in the things you need to consider, right? Because you also need to think of your weighting across different commodities and where you want exposure. And, to a degree, you're being asked to predict the future, right? Because, it takes years, sometimes decades to build a mine, and you don't want to build it in the wrong commodity in the wrong place that no one's going to want in 15 years from now. How do you approach that challenge versus we're a copper miner, we mine copper, and that's what it is?
So if I'm in a single commodity, so let me start there. Whether it's gold, nickel, wherever it may be, what's my position on the cost curve? And if I'm in a single commodity, I will want to be lower in the cost curve because my exposure to a single commodity and free cash flow is different. So you've got to be in the bottom half of the cost curve, but I want to be closer to the first quartile, say bottom of the second quartile, because I've got more degrees of freedom as the price. So keep debt low and know what you'll do and what you'll stop when times get tough. So what's critical and has to be done, make sure it gets done, particularly when you can afford it, but get it done, and then have a package of expenditures that you can defer for a period when times are tougher, and understand how to manage your discretionary costs through the cycle. In a diversified, you've got a bit more degrees of freedom, but I still think you need the discipline by each commodity to manage that cash flow with the same logic. But you've got a bit more scope as a diversified to allow something to continue to invest if it's long-term accretive and the rest of the portfolio is doing pretty well. So you've got a lot more flexibility. And you've got a lot more resource to call on to deal with a particular problem in a diversified. So the individual logic that you want your commodity leaders to follow is no different to being single commodity, but that you give them more freedom to put longer term investments in place and hold them in place longer. I also think the diversifieds have got the ability to look more into fundamental innovation. So at an Anglo, the way we set up our cost reduction program, which was very successful, and while some would argue some of the longer term stuff wasn't as economic in the short term, but by its very nature, that's quite deliberate. So we would have continuous improvement at the operating side. So a general manager dealing with all sorts of issues on a daily basis, we would expect to see them improve the business 3 to 5%, maybe 10% for a really good GM or an asset that's not doing well on an annual basis. So you're looking for continuous efficiency improvement. That's why your operating model is important. The second lot is the discipline head. So you've got really senior mining engineer at the centre saying, you know what, the best electric shovel in the world delivers 40 million tonnes a year. This is what literally happened at Anglo. Well, 45 million was the best electric shovels are in the coal basin in the US, and Peabody's got the best one. We said, well, why haven't we got the best assets? So at Dawson and those operations, we said we wanted to be at 50 million tonnes. So you're driving best practice through that knowledge of the industry, and then they're helping the guys implement change. And the third level, long-term innovation. Not long-term innovation from mining, but long-term innovation from other industries. Really radical ideas that will change the industry. So we had our cost improvement and productivity programs in 3 levels. And major diversifieds have got that capacity. And for Anglo, that was a key, I think, differentiator, particularly the middle package, and Donovan and the guys throwing across the fence new technologies for the guys to think about to improve our operations. And the bigger you are, the more latitude you've got in that area.
And where did you harvest ideas from? Were you looking to energy, to manufacturing? Where did you find the best or some of the most relevant ideas coming out of?
So the operating model and the asset integrity work we got out of the steel industry through Mick McAlee. So our operating model, where our experiences was we could improve the efficiency of an operating site by 30 to 50%. So it was the discipline of planning and scheduling work. So if you looked across the mining industry, only about 30% of the work that is carried out is properly planned. And the difference between properly planned work...
That's shocking. That's a shockingly
low
number. Sorry.
It's the reality. And that's after many audits before we introduced the operating model. It's not planned to the right level of detail. So it's that logic about planning and executing work. As I said, the energy sector, energy efficiency. Energy represents 20 to 30% of our costs. So how do you improve the efficiency of equipment? And in our Eco 2-man program, we cut our energy consumption by about 25%. And with new technologies like coarse particle recovery, we can reduce our energy consumption by around 20 to 30%. This is what we're looking at Vale. We reduce our water consumption by 50%, and we improve our operating throughputs by around 20%. So there are technologies that we get from processing, energy sector, water, in terms of understanding how to recover more water so that our water consumption. So all those industries, we do what we call open forums. We said, okay, we want to reduce our water consumption by 50%. So we'd have all these people brought in for 3 days working the problem. The one criteria was we weren't allowed to have more than 30% of the people in those forums from external organisations that came from mining. We wanted them to be external, and the ideas that they brought to the table helped change how we looked at the problems in our industry.
Interesting. And when you're leading one of these diversified miners, how do you make decisions on how you want to grow those businesses, right? So at one point you've optimized your current assets, things are going well, you've increased, production, you've increased profits. How do you go about thinking about growing these businesses? Are you just looking for, okay, these are the best assets we can find out there that we can get the most out of, agnostic of commodity? Or do you take a view on copper or uranium or what have you, and you say, okay, we need to find exposure to that commodity? How does that work?
I think the way we thought about it was, what markets do you think will grow?
Yeah.
And I don't know who coined it, but we use the term future-facing commodities. So we could see the demand for copper being key to the energy transition. So copper, nickel, lithium. But when we looked at those three commodities, we sort of said, well, copper, we've got a starting point, but we think development of Quellaveco, that's a great place to be, because copper's in broad demand for a number of applications. So we thought that was a good bet. And that's turned out to be a good bet. Nickel, a little bit tougher because Indonesia is such a big player. They're going to dominate supply, maybe for 5 years, but long term, nickel's a good place to be. But you're probably going to have to be patient till about 2028, 29, where you're really going to start to see increasing prices. But it's a good place to be, and that's why the Vale position was interesting for me. Lithium, great place to be from a demand point of view, but the world's full of lithium. There's lots of lithium everywhere. And so thinking about, okay, is that a good place to be now, or am I better off letting people develop lots of stuff? People are going to lose money. And at some point, when the demand is starting to look like it's going to run ahead of the ability of the industry to supply, there will be some assets you can pick up that will do pretty well. So your strategy in those areas is different depending on your view on demand and supply dynamics.
You're the chair of Vale Base Metals today. Obviously, you led Anglo for a long time, Anglo American. What, in your mind, what are the things going on in the world today that are driving decision making on where you want to be investing? And you can speak for Vale, or you can speak generally across the industry, where these sort of major miners are looking to deploy capital today. What are the factors that they see as an opportunity and perhaps as a risk that they're concerned about or trying to avoid?
So if you've got a great iron ore asset, even at $70 a tonne, whatever the number may be, it's still a good place to be. But you're going to have to be tight on your costs, and your ability to throw lots of capital at those businesses is becoming a lot tougher because you've got Guinea and other areas that will impact the supply side. But it's still a good place to be. The world's going to need steel. In fact, the most important metal for the energy transition is steel.
Yeah,
because of the infrastructure.
yeah.
So there's a big tick there. Copper, broad demand base. Even if you see some substitution, if you've got a good copper deposit, you're in a good place to be. Again, it's thinking about where you can leverage the best margins and returns, and so your capital allocation decisions are really important. And sometimes miners make decisions that people are critical of, because they say, well, wait a minute, I'll give you a good example. We were criticised for Woodsmith, the investment in Woodsmith, which is the Anglo polyhalite deposit. And in us talking about that, in the end, you don't know exactly when the market will be there, but it's a unique product. You can mine it and it doesn't have to go through a lot of processing. Carbon footprint is 85% below other competitors, and it's a multi-salt product, which is quite unique. Now, it's going to take time. So the question becomes, how do you put your foot on something like that and nurture it until its time comes? And so I still think it's a great asset. The question is when, and that's a big challenge for miners, because you're thinking about short term, and where does a major invest? And if you look at the money that BHP's put into its phosphate deposits or its deposits in Canada, it's put a lot of money in there, and it's taken a long time. But in the end, that will be a set of assets that will pay off long term. So how do you get that balance right? And you're going to get as a leader, you're going to cop some flack for somebody that thinks about the dividend in the next quarter. But if you're going to create one of these houses that builds off the critical mass that's been established, then you've got to make some of those decisions. But then how you manage it through the process is actually key.
It's a really interesting time, right? Because I feel like the mining industry, I'll espouse my personal theory here and you can tell me where I'm wrong. So I feel like the mining industry is in a bit of identity crisis or a state of crisis right now. We see the junior and mid-tier industry is extremely starved for capital right now. The exploration companies are dying on the vine right now. There's no money that is looking to go into them, certainly in Canada, to a lesser degree in Australia. On the other hand, we constantly hear espoused the energy transition, urbanization, this massive coming demand driver for metals. I've heard the term, we need to mine more copper over the next whatever it is 25 years than we have in all of human history today. That comes down the pike a lot. And yet we've barely seen copper price move in any major way over the last several years. And we're seeing gold price hit all-time highs, but gold miners just perform marginally. And so there's a lot of conflicting signals right now. And I'm going to put a little tangent here. I also don't see there a tremendous amount of major discoveries being made or new mines being found. So how does the industry address this coming demand wave, in theory, which has been just around the corner for the last decade or so, versus the reality of a very complicated market right now? Is it just is it M&A right now within the industry and a consolidation? I mean, we saw BHP take a run at Anglo earlier this year as a potential acquisition. Are we going to see a consolidation of the major miners? Are we going to see someone start writing checks into exploration again to try to find these next tier one deposits? How do you, I realize I'm asking an incredibly complex question, but how do you envision this playing out? And I have some pet theories, but I'd love to hear yours.
First thing, as leaders in the industry, we have to go look in the mirror and admit what a lousy job we've done promoting our role in society. And people know I've been harping on this for 20 years. And some people say, well, you're doing too much of it. And I said, well, we have to do it. Everybody has to do their bit. That me not doing it isn't an excuse, or me doing it because no one else is doing it. We've got to change the dialogue. We aren't helping people understand how important we are. Today, when I say, look, I'm Mark, and they said, well, what do you do? I actually say now, I work for the industry that has the most significantly positive environmental footprint on the face of the planet. Can you guess what industry I'm involved in? No one has guessed it yet. that it's mining, and it's not the obvious answer. And the last time I said that, they said, well, how do you get that to be net positive? And I said, well, if you just think about agriculture, and without fertilizers and mechanized gear, which all come from mining products, instead of 40% of the planet, we'd need 50 to 60% of the planet to feed 8 billion people. We make agriculture or allow agriculture to be done in a much smaller footprint. So that's a human footprint. Urban environments. If I look out your back window, I see all these high-rise buildings, and infrastructure is all being concentrated. So the populations are concentrated. So our urban footprint is 15%, not 30%. Without mining, we couldn't do it. So when I look at, we take up 0.3% of the Earth's surface. 0.3%. And we reduce the human footprint by 30%. We are the key, and nobody knows. And when I talk about mining products and what they're used for, which is everything, because you don't create matter, whilst we still theoretically understand how we might do it with energy, it's not something we do every day. So mining's role in society is not very well explained. As a consequence, from discovery to development, it now takes us 20 years, where it used to take 6 or 7 years. So we've got to help people understand how important mining is, and so that the conversations on access to land have to be on the understanding that we need mining to support 8 billion people on the planet. Now, the question is, and I'm not suggesting unfettered access, but turning 20 years back into 6 or 7 years is the only way we're going to be able to deal with the energy transition. The only way we're going to be able to deal with a lack of water to support the globe and everything everybody wants to do. And a whole range of other things are not possible without mining. So the question is mining plus circular economy. So it's not simply about mining. It's about how mining can actually help create a circular economy, because many of the products that are used in buildings, we've got processes and technologies that can actually allow those technologies or those materials to be reused. So we're the key to the future as well. And I think we've got to think differently and tell our story differently.
What do you think is the catalyst to make people, or to enable people to kind of wake up and start appreciating the impact of mining? I mean, I agree with you that the industry needs to frame and champion this better, but certainly there's a lot of people that I think would refuse to acknowledge that based on somewhat ideological environmental positions. And what I often fear is that the only path to people acknowledging the importance of mining, and to a similar degree energy and fossil fuels, is some sort of catastrophic failure of the system, right? Where there isn't enough copper, or the lights don't turn on one day, or there's food shortages because, something like 40% of people are fed off synthetic fertilizers or some version of that. That's what I'm somewhat concerned about.
We're in that world now. We are in that world now, whether we like it or not, whether it's climate change. And I'm not going to debate, the body of scientific evidence supports it. And it's not all man-made, I know that, but we're contributing, and we're contributing materially to the problem, and we can make a difference. So climate change, water will be rapidly following climate change as another environmental catastrophe. And my view, food. I'm involved with the power of nutrition, as people know, and those issues are coming at us at a rate of knots, and helping people understand how we find solutions and how we improve the speed to those solutions requires us as leaders to do a better job communicating to not it must be the public, but to get to key stakeholders. So when somebody said we did stuff at the Vatican trying to engage with a broad range of religious groups, not simply Catholic, but Catholics, the full Christian groupings, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, And we said that explaining how important mining was to the world was something people didn't understand. And in fact, the indigenous groups got it better than we got it in the cities because they used the earth in different ways. The Greeks
Yeah.
understood it 2,000 years ago. So it's getting the key players, the multilaterals, the United Nations. Let's talk to Mr. Gutierrez and explain why mining is so important to his energy transition imperative. We need to engage those groups much more effectively. Rawatish Dawan at the ICMM has been a great champion for these conversations in the last 3 or 4 years, but he needs every one of the leaders in that group to talk more than he does and to be champions, and they're not. And we all need to be champions of the debate and get those conversations engaged. And the one thing, and I've used this many times, when we got to the Anglican Church and the Archbishop of Canterbury was involved in the work we did with the church groups, after 5 years, he came out with a press statement and said, look, we've looked at the Bible for the last 5 years. We can't find any passage that argues against mining. Therefore, from our point of view, we can support mining as long as it's done responsibly. Now, people say, oh, well, that's a bit of a giggle. I said, no, it's not. I said, and Christine Lagarde asked me, and she was at the Vatican on an ethical business conference as I was there, and she said, why did you start this mining stuff with the Vatican? I said, Christine, it's 1.6 billion people. They're bigger than China. If I can get the church talking about how important mining is and at least have local communities engage with our industry and be supportive if they do things properly, that's a game changer for literally everyone. It changes the world. And I said, so it's not a bad place to start, but we've also got to do the multilaterals. We've got to work with governments. We've got to work with all the key players that make those decisions. And we have to explain to communities why it's so important maybe to develop this part of the town to actually support the rest of the countryside to be successful. And so we have to do a much better job on the ground with our communities, because in the end, if you can get your local community relationships right, you'll be successful as a miner.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to go from here to here and be able to cover all of those conversations, and we're not good at it as miners.
Just thinking about what you're saying, and how do you envision sort of key stakeholder relationships changing in the mining industry over the coming years? And let me frame where that question's coming from, in addition to what you're saying, because I think it's a very interesting element, sort of bringing the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church on board and thinking about the constituencies that they influence and educate. But I look at, we have a war going on in Europe right now. We have a war in the Middle East right now. In Canada, we have the Canadian government blocking Chinese acquisitions of assets that are in South America, but owned by Canadian companies. So the whole political landscape that mining operates in is changing pretty drastically, I would say, over the last 5 or 6 years, right? We're going from a very open border world to a much more nationalistic world, it appears to me. And that has so many implications for supply chains and whatnot. How do you envision, you're working for Vale, obviously, but the whole industry addressing these challenges and sort of predicting what's coming down the pipe? Is it closer relationships with certain governments? Is it, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but how do you start thinking about these problems and preparing for what might be a very different future?
One thing that when Brexit was occurring, I was asked the question, what do you think of Brexit? And I said, look, I'm against anything that puts a barrier in terms of trade between nations. Today, whether we understand it or not, health of our global citizens is better than it's ever been, life expectancy, and we've got all sorts of issues across the globe. And we could all do a lot better in helping those that are struggling. But trade is the key, and comparative advantage. Anything that constrains trade, wars, they're all difficult and will create pockets of poverty that We can see already emerging immigration, civilization of people moving to other areas, wars, all those sorts of things are all issues that work against trade, which is the key to lifting everybody out of poverty and improving everyone's life. And we've all got a responsibility in one way, shape, or another. And that's a personal view, and it is a very personal view, to try and make a difference. And I think that our ability, critical minerals is a good example, and critical minerals is an opportunity for the mining industry to talk about what it does and how it makes a difference. It's also key where it can become an opportunity for cooperation, not competition. Now, there will be competition, and there's a obvious debate around the Chinese and domination in rare earths. There's the US repositioning itself in Africa, looking to access critical minerals. Every country is in the same place. These minerals are now strategic. And what I've said is, it's okay to be competitive, but let's not be destructive in stopping each other from doing things. Let's be competitive and understand how we can be constructive and not close off options, which then means people are pushed towards, instead of trading, we're firing bullets.
Yeah.
So that conversation about resources and access to resources, I think, is critical. And we're in an industry where I'd like to see trade unfettered, almost unfettered. It has to be. We have to protect human rights and value chains being appropriately managed. But trade's the key, and that's my greatest fear. And I think the stakeholders, as you asked, what's the stakeholder question? That's why the multilaterals, faith-based organisations can be more powerful than almost any, because when I look at faith-based organisations, I don't see religion. I see values, I see culture. And being respectful of people's values and beliefs means that we can dialogue and find common ground. And when you talk to a theologian, and I'm not religious, it's just an observation on values and beliefs, that if we can at least get those dialogues running across borders, also through the multilaterals and through other institutions and organisations, even organised labour and other groups that are concerned with human rights, it changes the nature of the dialogue. And I understand the politics, and I'm not a right-wing loony or a left-wing loony. I'm around the centre, depending on the circumstances. But I believe that the dialogue that sits across politics is absolutely key to maintain balance in the way we relate to each other and talk to each other. And again, it might be idealistic, but we've got to get out there as leaders and try and talk a sensible conversation as opposed to a polarizing political conversation. I think that's key at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And do you think that the Western miners and the Western mining investment infrastructure, shall we say, is going to be able to, I mean, I don't think it has been as competitive as it once was against, say, Chinese investment, who have really secured many of the assets globally. These sort of state-backed entities, some of the sovereign wealth funds, obviously pouring a tremendous amount of money into this industry. I look at these sort of state players and I see, they're locking down assets with less concern about those assets being profitable and more concern about them simply being feedstock into the other industries that they're building. And are the Western miners going to be able to remain competitive against that? When an Anglo or a Vale needs to be a profitable company under its own right, can they compete against the Chinese state-backed entity that just needs the iron ore or copper or lithium or what have you?
First thing, I'm an absolute believer in the power of innovation and reward for innovation. So I'm open market. I'm an entrepreneur. I want to see innovation. I want to encourage innovation in every way we can. I do see problems where governments overly interfere. They always influence, but where they interfere and create market disconnects that don't allow the markets to work reasonably efficiently. And by the
Hmm.
way, all markets need regulation and appropriate management on the basis of fairness across society, because if you get that wrong, then you've got all sorts of other issues. So there's a balance. What I've said in my dialogue with American leaders who are sort of saying, well, we've got to get critical minerals and we're not going to take it from them, we're not going to take it from them, but we're going to take it from these guys. I think their concern is that they can't get certain materials, therefore they're going to have to lock away supply. That is an entirely logical and appropriate response to, let's say, the Chinese dominating certain markets. But I think there's a different dialogue, and it's a bit like the old song, "The Russians love their children. The Russians love their children too." There's a conversation that the US and China have. I would love to see where they work out. Let's find a compromise here, and I can only hope that in the US and in China there's a willingness to dialogue, because the alternatives are unpalatable. And in
Yeah.
some parts of the world, we're seeing the alternatives play out now. And we want to see that come back. We need dialogue. So it's, what is it? Jaw, jaw, not war, war. And I think those sorts of issues are becoming more and more important in the world today. And in the end, we are so reliant on the leadership of China, the US, and other key players that, in my view, as business leaders, if we can provide, or if we can model the behavior we would like to see, then at least it shows that it can be done, that companies can be profitable, as Anglo was the most profitable company over that period that we were involved in, with the innovation and looking at how we did things differently. There are things that we can do to help each other. By the way, I would never be as arrogant to suggest that we were the example. I'm saying Microsoft, those technology companies have been
Yeah.
so successful. What can we learn on the positive side? And at the end of the day, why wouldn't you encourage other countries to have successful businesses? But there are a set of rules that we do need to try and align on as leaders. And I think we've lost that dialogue to some degree, and we need it. And as miners, because we're across all jurisdictions, we've got a better dialogue amongst our industry leaders than I think politicians have got
Yeah.
on a country by country basis. It would be good if we could help maybe bring some of those conversations together.
It's true. Mining really does give you a unique viewpoint of so many places in the world that the average business leader doesn't get either. Do you think, you mentioned, the Microsofts or whomever, these sort of big, hyper successful tech companies. Do you think there's a world where they start to think, okay, maybe we need to start thinking about locking down our own supply chains? Maybe we need to be buying the tier one nickel mines or copper mines or what have you. We need to build chips. I mean, because if you think about throughout my career, and I think probably most of your career, the mining industry has kind of become more decentralized, right? There's been more companies, there's been more breakup. Whereas
More
in
specialized.
previous, yeah, but in previous generations, you had mines owned by General Electric, by major energy companies. You had mines as components of other companies. And I wonder if we're entering a consolidation phase where the only one who has cheap enough capital to go really be competitive in buying these things are the Teslas or the Microsofts or the Apples of the world that can go out and
It's
compete.
happening now. It's happening now. I had a conversation with Jeff Immelt in 2011,
CEO of General
and
Electric.
yeah, we built a processing plant, a water processing plant in South Africa, and he was supplying some of the technology. And he asked me the question. He said, if in my conversation at General Electric, what should I talk to my team about in terms of threats in respect of minerals? And I said, in 10 to 20 years' time, your biggest issue will be that you won't be able to get the materials you need to make the products you produce. He said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, And I used my 7 year, it used to take 7 years. At that stage, it used to take 15 years. Now it's at 20 years. So I said, we just do the maths and the curves, and yes, you'll improve your efficiencies, but you're going to run out of key materials. Now I call them special materials or materials you need to make your product. That world is now. So auto manufacturers and a whole range of other players who need very specific technologies and materials are locking their supply away as we speak. It's happening now. Countries are saying, you know what, we're going to have to reposition in Africa, and I won't say who, but they're all looking at how do they take a position in Africa, get access to copper, nickel, rare earths, a whole range of products. It's happening now. So it's not this is not 20 or 30 years away. This is in the world we're in today.
Okay. Mark, we've been at this for about an hour and a half now. This is one of my longer podcasts, and I literally have pages of questions I could keep going through, but I want to, start wrapping things up and be respectful of your time. Is there anything happening in the mining industry right now that you're either very excited about or maybe concerned about that people are not aware of, that should be on people's radar that isn't?
So I'm always excited about our industry because I think we could do so much better. I think we do so many things so well, and I think Rawatish and the guys at the ICMM have been doing some really good work and really messaging quite well. I think it's important as leaders we amplify that message. So I don't think we're doing our job in supporting enough. That's first point. Second point, I think our own self-awareness is increasing quite rapidly, particularly through critical minerals, and trying to work out how we improve our messaging, because critical minerals is an opportunity in many ways for us to talk about the industry. So how do we do that in a constructive way? So I think I'm excited that the messaging that we were driving 15 years ago and was really difficult is becoming easier because of critical minerals. But the trouble is, the reason critical minerals are critical is because we've got climate change, we've got water, we've got these. So those issues worry me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we could do so much more to support those. And I think that the message is getting out that we could be a lot more assertive, a lot more vocal, a lot more assertive, and a lot more constructive in helping people understand how we can do things without destroying the planet. In fact, it's the opposite, how we help preserve and create a more sustainable planet. So I think the understanding of those issues, the technologies that are available for us to improve the way we do our work, the improved safety performance, are all things that I think are going in the right direction, but need to go quicker. So I'm excited about those sorts of things, those opportunities, and I'm excited about what I see in young people. I remember as an 18-year-old, we talked about it earlier, Wollongong, surf, girlfriend, earning my way through work or paying my way through university. They were the big issues at that time. It wasn't about saving the planet or making a difference. With the development of the internet, the awareness of young people in terms of the fragility of the planet,
Mm-hmm.
the importance of making a difference, we've got a young generation that I think will change, as they should, the nature of the planet, and the dialogues that are possible with their awareness and their understanding of how fragile things are, I think is a great hope for the future. And so I'm ever the optimist. I've got 7 kids and 8 grandkids, and anything I can do to help them have a different set of conversations and be leaders in a different in how we have different conversations across the globe is my great hope for the future.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I've got a couple rapid fire questions before we close it off. They're supposed to be, we'll see how they go. We'll see how we do. So, number one, if you could buy, so all your money, all your wealth stripped away from you, you've got $10 million, you can buy a royalty or stream on one commodity. What do you do? What do you buy it on?
Copper.
Copper. Okay. If you were 30 years old, starting a company today that was a service business to the mining industry, what would you be focused on?
Resource and mining strategies.
Resource and mining strategies.
We're absolutely short that role, and the last great thinker, in my view, in the industry was Oscar Stephan. We miss him terribly.
And this is effectively resource estimates and then wrapping the economics around that, building out mine plans.
It's such a big issue to the industry, and it's a skill we're losing.
If you could have dinner with any historical figure, who would it be?
Now, I got asked this question, and I gave there's so many different ways you could come at this one. I guess you'd have to say Jesus Christ, Genghis Khan, Adolf Hitler. One, maybe you could change the course of history, or two, you could learn something, or three, you could have a very different perspective on the world. There's a list there of people that have made such a difference, good and bad.
Yeah. So what would you have to eat? You'd eat olives, fermented mare's milk, and schnitzel, I guess. That'd be quite the dinner.
if it were certain characters, you'd probably suggest arsenic, and me going down with them might be good for the world, but with others, there might be pearls of wisdom. But somebody that's made a difference. And by the way, it could be Mother Teresa. And listening to their perspectives, good or bad, is always a learning experience and instructive, good and bad. There's such a long list of people that I could talk. Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah.
Coolest guy that ever lived.
Okay, last question. Any books you'd recommend? You mentioned you had a mentor that, gave you a book every 3 months. Anything that really stood out? Anything you've recommended consistently to people you're working with?
Vaclav Smil, the way the world really works.
Yeah, I have read that book. It's great. Yeah.
It's an eye-opener for people, and it's one of the things that I think should be on the course for all kids. Because I think it would change their perspective. And as they say, if you can get to kids before they're 11 years old, you can actually have an influence on what career decisions they make, which I learned last week.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for your time today. Any final words, final thoughts, anything people should be thinking about, anything you want to leave our listeners with?
Jamie, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for what you do in talking about our industry and the things we do. It's very important for us to get our message out. We don't do it terribly well, and so we appreciate gentlemen like yourself trying to get the message out and help people understand what we do, and thanks for the opportunity.
Very much appreciated. Very happy to have you on here. You're the first CEO of a really major international mining company we've had, and it's something I've wanted to do for a long time. So thank you for taking the time today.
Thanks, Sean, and all the best.